Hello and welcome to the screencast. So I get this question every year and I totally understand it. What is an empirically derived test? Okay, so first of all, what is empiricism? So empiricism is the bedrock of science, and I'm not asking you to accept all of this. I'm just simply giving you the information. Obviously, I'd want you to embrace science, but I think there are some issues, some philosophical issues with empiricism, but that's for another day. So empiricism, when you think empiricism, I want you to think of science. It's the methodology that scientists use, and it is connected to systematically testing ideas and observing things systematically, like we would do in an experiment or a naturalistic observation or a case study, right? It's the idea that knowledge is gained through observation. We are not just born with knowledge. We have to actually observe the world to gain knowledge. All right, now what's an empirically derived test? Now, this is the definition that Myers gives. Now, I want you to understand that when we use the word discriminate, we are not using it pejoratively. We are not using it in a negative way to discriminate against a certain group of people. Discrimination means to see a difference between a group of people. It does not have to have the negative connotation that we usually associate with it, okay? It can sometimes, but in this context, it does not. So basically, that's the definition. Selecting a group, creating a pool of questions, and then selecting the questions that help us discriminate between two groups. Okay, here's the context. Most personality inventory tests, so the MMPI was the one they used the example of in your book, and this is on page 578. Remember, personality inventory tests, right, give you a large group of questions, and they're trying to assess specific behaviors. Now, the MMPI, when it was first constructed by Hathaway, what Hathaway was trying to do was distinguish between abnormal and normal individuals psychologically. Again, we can question those, but I just want to give you this information. And what he was trying to do was figure out on this. He had already designed a group of questions, a large group of questions, and what he wanted to do was give this almost like this battery of tests, like multiple questions, hundreds of questions to people who he had already labeled. So the key here is the people are already categorized. All right, they're already categorized as normal or abnormal, and then he gives the test to them. And what he wants to see is what are the specific test questions where there are patterns of difference, meaning that most of the people in this group answer those specific questions differently than most of the people in this group. And then he was hoping that those questions can give us some insight into abnormality and normality. Okay? So let's actually, as opposed to doing it that way, let's actually make this a little bit easier to understand, and let's focus on depressed and non-depressed people. So let's say that we already have diagnosed certain people with depression, and then certain people have not met the criteria for depression. So we have our depressed people and our non-depressed people, and we give them a test similar to the MMPI. Right? That is empirically derived. So how do we get it to be empirically derived? Well, we start with a broad pool of questions. We give it to both groups, the clinically depressed and the non-depressed. And then we key in on certain questions. Notice this is like a funnel. I'm getting smaller, right? As I go in, I key in on certain questions. And I am going to key in on those specific questions. So now we're getting even smaller, in which the depressed people consistently. So I'm looking for a pattern that is consistent, where depressed people answer specific questions differently than non-depressed people. So again, I'm looking for a pattern that is consistent. And then those specific questions, I'm going to isolate and select them as being informative in discriminating between the depressed and the non-depressed people. So I start with, let's just say, maybe numbers will help you here. Let's just say I started with 300 questions, but maybe it was only 35 questions that I'm going to select that are actually going to help me discriminate between the two groups. It doesn't mean I throw out all the rest of the questions. It means in terms of being able to distinguish between depressed and non-depressed, these 35 are the ones that are really, really specific. Now, because we're scientists, what we're going to do is we're going to keep giving this test to people who have been diagnosed with clinical depression and those who have not. And we're going to keep seeing, are these the 35 questions that continually get answered differently? And if they do, we're going to say, these are the questions we're definitely going to keep using to help us distinguish depressed and non-depressed people. So we're going to select those questions. And that would meet the criteria for an empirically derived test, because I have consistently given it to people systematically, and I've consistently gotten the same results. And those results help me to distinguish between depressed and non-depressed people. Now, here's where it can come really helpful. Now I can give this test to people who perhaps have not been yet diagnosed with depression. And if we see that certain individuals answer these 35 questions similar to these people, well, maybe we know those people are more at risk for depression, and perhaps we can give them some assistance to prevent their depression from either developing fully, or maybe we'll realize that they are themselves depressed and we can get them the help they need. But that's what an empirically derived test is. I hope that helped.